Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night when the whole world is still asleep with a strange feeling that something fundamental is not right? Not with your life specifically, but with everything around you, with the very structure of the reality we inhabit? That moment when you stare at the ceiling and feel a void you cannot name, a discomfort that does not fit into the categories of problems we were taught to recognize, modern medicine quickly classifies this experience as a disorder, a chemical imbalance, a dysfunction, depression, anxiety, burnout. Names that seem to explain, but in fact only encapsulate the experience in a convenient box that allows us to treat it as an individual anomaly, a flaw in the human machine that needs to be corrected so we can return to normal functioning. But what if this discomfort were not a flaw? What if this inexplicable emptiness, this persistent restlessness, this feeling that something is deeply wrong with the world as we built it, were not a problem of individual adaptation, but an awakening to a truth that our civilization has systematically tried to hide from ourselves? This is the possibility I want to explore today. The idea that what we call depression may, in many cases, not be a disease, but a process of spiritual awakening, a healthy response to a sick world, a sign that something in our consciousness is trying to break through the collective illusions that sustain our society. Throughout thousands of years, humanity developed sophisticated systems to understand and give meaning to existential suffering. Ancient civilizations, from India to Greece, from Egypt to China, all had conceptual frameworks that recognized states of disconnection and emptiness as potentially valuable parts of human experience. In the Buddhist tradition, for example, suffering is not seen as a problem to be eliminated at any cost, but as a portal to understanding the illusory nature of conventional reality. What ancient Zen masters called the beginner's mind often begins with a sense of disorientation, of loss of meaning in social conventions and in the stories we tell ourselves. Christian mystics spoke of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual desolation that precedes union with the divine. Shamans of indigenous cultures recognized that certain forms of mental suffering were not illnesses, but calls to a journey of transformation and healing that would benefit not only the individual, but the entire community. Even in ancient Greece, melancholy was associated not only with dysfunction, but also with genius and the ability to see beyond shared illusions. But at some point in recent centuries, we lost these nuances in the understanding of existential suffering. The scientific and industrial revolutions brought a new worldview that gradually became dominant. In this new narrative, the human being came to be seen as a biological machine whose main purpose is to function efficiently within the economic and social system. Happiness was redefined as successful adaptation to this system, and consequently, unhappiness, melancholy, the sense of emptiness or lack of meaning, all these experiences came to be seen not as potential messengers of deeper truths, but as failures in the normal functioning of the human machine. Failures that need to be corrected, preferably in the fastest and least disruptive possible way, so that the individual can return to being a productive participant in the system. The medicalization of existential suffering became the standard approach. We no longer have a soul, we have neurochemistry. We no longer have existential crises, we have adaptation disorders. We do not experience the dark night that precedes spiritual awakening. We suffer from major depressive disorder. I'm not suggesting, of course, that there are no real neurological conditions that cause intense mental suffering and that benefit enormously from modern medical treatment. It would be irresponsible to deny the reality of severe clinical depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and other conditions that can be devastating when untreated. What I am questioning is whether we are applying this medical model far too broadly, pathologizing experiences that may have a completely different dimension, whether we are losing something valuable by automatically translating all states of existential discomfort into the language of dysfunction, illness, and treatment. And what worries me most, whether this reductionist approach is preventing us collectively from recognizing important signs about deeper problems in our civilization. Think about the numbers. Recent studies show that between 20% and 30% of the adult population in industrialized countries suffers from some form of diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. Rates of depression and anxiety have risen steadily in recent decades, especially among young people. Antidepressant consumption has grown more than 400% since 2000 inches, many developed countries. When a supposedly pathological condition affects 1/3 of a population, we need to start questioning whether we are really facing an epidemic of individual dysfunction or whether something more fundamental is happening. Whether we are mistaken about cause and effect, whether the problem lies in individuals who cannot adapt, or in the system to which we demand they adapt. Plato's cave analogy may be useful here. In the famous philosophical myth, Plato describes prisoners chained since childhood in a cave, forced to look only at a wall where they see shadows projected by the real world behind them, outside the reach of their vision. For these prisoners, the shadows are the only reality they know. Now imagine that one of these prisoners is somehow freed and forced out of the cave. Initially, the sunlight would blind him, causing pain and confusion. He would resist, preferring to return to the comfortable familiarity of the cave and its shadows. But gradually, as his eyes adjusted, he would begin to see the real world for the first time. If this former prisoner returned to the cave to tell the others what he saw, they would consider him crazy, delusional, dysfunctional. His behavior would be seen as a pathology by the standards of cave society. It's not hard to see the parallel with our situation. We live in a civilization that has built an extraordinarily complex social reality, filled with conventions, unexamined assumptions, and value structures we absorb from childhood. This reality is so dominant, so total in its influence, that we rarely have the opportunity to question it or even recognize that it is a construction, not an absolute truth. We accept that the value of a human life can be measured by economic productivity. We accept that it is normal to spend most of our waking hours doing work that has no intrinsic meaning to us. We accept that success must be defined primarily in material terms. We accept that the continued exploitation of the planet's natural resources is the necessary price of progress. We accept all these premises not because we examined them critically and decided they were true, but because we were born into a society that treats them as obvious, as simply the way things are. And then sometimes something happens to an individual that begins to break this spell. It may be a trauma, a loss, an unexpected encounter with natural beauty, a mystical experience, or simply the gradual accumulation of small inconsistencies that can no longer be ignored. The veil begins to unravel. The shadows begin to seem less solid. And the individual begins to feel first vaguely and then more clearly that the reality presented as complete and inescapable is in fact only a small fraction of what is possible. That the stories our culture tells about what is valuable, about how we should live, about what it means to be human, are just that, stories. Stories we can choose to believe or not. This realization is deeply disorienting, as one would expect. If you had spent your whole life believing you lived in a solid building and suddenly realized you were actually on a theater set with fake walls that can be moved or removed, your first reaction would not be liberation, it would be terror. The loss of reference points, an existential freefall. And this is exactly what many people experience at the beginning of what I call spiritual awakening. A sharp sense that the structures that gave stability to your identity and your world are dissolving. That the script you were handed to live no longer makes sense, but there is not yet a new script to replace it. It is a state of suspension between worlds. Modern society, unfortunately, has no conceptual tools to understand this state. We have no rites of passage to mark and facilitate such transformations. We have no elders and experienced guides who recognize the signs of awakening and can offer guidance through this difficult territory. What we have are psychiatric diagnoses, medications that suppress symptoms without addressing causes, and constant pressure to get better soon and return to normal functioning. That is, return to being a productive, uncritical participant in the system. Think about the paradoxical situation we are in. Our planet is facing unprecedented ecological crises. Our social structures are producing record levels of inequality. Our economies are organized around perpetual growth that is mathematically impossible in a finite system. Our technologies are developing faster than our ability to understand their implications or regulate their impacts. In summary, our collective way of life is on a collision course with physical, biological, and psychological reality. And yet, when individuals begin to feel a deep discomfort with this state of affairs, when they begin to question the fundamental premises of our civilization, when they feel paralyzed by the enormity of the problems we face, we diagnose them as sick. We treat the pain they feel as a failure of adaptation instead of an appropriate response to a genuinely alarming situation. I want to pause for a moment to ask, do you also feel this deep disconnection in your daily life? This sense that although we are more connected than ever through technology, something essential has been lost along the way? I know it may be difficult to put into words. Many of us carry this weight in silence, believing we are the only ones feeling this particular void. But you're not alone in this. If this feeling resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. It can be as simple as writing, "I feel this disconnection when," filling in with your personal experience. Your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone in their struggle. Sometimes naming what we feel is the first step toward transforming it. Modern technology has greatly intensified this dilemma. The same digital tools that promised to connect us are often isolating us in algorithmic bubbles that reflect our own perspectives back at us. The same social networks that should facilitate authentic communities are often promoting toxic comparisons and a constant sense of inadequacy. The same devices that should give us more freedom over how we use our time are paradoxically making us more accessible to work at any hour, eroding the boundaries between professional and personal life. And perhaps most disturbing, the same platforms that should democratize access to information are actually monetizing our attention and turning it into a resource to be extracted for corporate profit, often at the expense of our mental health and our ability to think deeply. It is not difficult to see how all of this would create the perfect conditions for an epidemic of alienation, of disconnection, of loss of meaning. And when these experiences become unbearable, our system classifies them as individual diseases, separated from their social and cultural context. We offer cognitive behavioral therapy to help people better adapt to intrinsically dehumanizing conditions. We prescribe medication to adjust their neurochemistry to an environment that is in itself neurochemically destabilizing. In short, we treat the individual to avoid having to examine the system. But here is the deeper paradox. This suffering that we try so desperately to diagnose, medicate, and eliminate may be in many cases not a sign of illness, but the beginning of healing, not a descent into pathology, but a rise toward a higher level of consciousness. For it is precisely this feeling of disconnection from the dominant narratives of our culture that can make room for new ways of seeing, understanding, and being. It is in the space opened by the dissolution of our previous certainties that new possibilities can emerge. This process has been recognized and named in various ways in different spiritual traditions. In Jungian psychology, it is called individuation, the process through which the individual differentiates from collective identities and finds his own center. In shamanic traditions, it is often described as a symbolic death and rebirth, a necessary decomposition of the old self so that a new, more authentic one may emerge. In Buddhism, it can be seen as the beginning of awakening from the dream of ignorance, the recognition that our ordinary perception of reality is fundamentally distorted. In the mystical traditions of various religions, it is often described as a dark night of the soul that precedes union with the divine. All these traditions recognize that this process of transformation is not easy or comfortable. On the contrary, it is often described as a form of death because it is, in a certain sense, the death of a previous identity, of a way of seeing the world that no longer serves. And like any death, it comes with fear, resistance, mourning for the loss of what was familiar, even if what was familiar was ultimately limiting or illusory. But all these traditions also affirm that if this process is understood and navigated consciously, rather than suppressed or pathologized, it can lead to a way of being that is more authentic, more connected, more whole. That on the other side of this valley of shadows is the possibility of a life lived with more truth, more compassion, more wisdom, a life no longer based on unconscious conformity to external narratives, but on a direct connection with our own experience, with others, with the natural world, perhaps even with dimensions of reality that our dominant cultural paradigm does not even recognize. This leads me to the most difficult and also most important question: how can we differentiate between pathological depression, which would really benefit from medical intervention, and this process of spiritual awakening, which may present itself with superficially similar symptoms, but which requires a completely different approach? I do not have definitive or universal answers to this question. The line between illness and transformation is often thin and complex, and it varies enormously from individual to individual. But I can offer some reflections that may be useful for those navigating this difficult territory. First, the quality of the suffering often differs. Clinical depression tends to be characterized by a sense of heaviness, numbness, absolute hopelessness, often accompanied by intense self-loathing and specific suicidal thoughts. It is a closing and narrowing of experience. Spiritual awakening, on the other hand, even when painful, tends to have a different quality. There is often an underlying sense that something important is happening, even if it is difficult to articulate. There are moments of clarity, insights, openness. There is pain, yes, but it is more like growing pain, a process of expansion, not contraction. There is questioning rather than hopeless certainty. Second, the relationship with the external world is often different. In clinical depression, the world typically seems empty, meaningless, without interest. In spiritual awakening, there may be a sense that the world contains more, not less, meaning, but that this meaning cannot be accessed through familiar conceptual categories. There may be an intensified sense of beauty in simple things, moments of deep connection with nature, with other people, with dimensions of experience that do not fit into the prevailing materialist worldview. There is often a sense of purpose emerging, even if it is not yet clear what that purpose is. Third, the attitude toward the process itself is often revealing. People in the midst of a spiritual awakening often have a sense, even if vague, that their suffering has a purpose, that there is something to be learned or achieved through it. There is a willingness to engage with the process, to explore it, to try to understand it. In clinical depression, on the other hand, the suffering typically feels completely meaningless, something to be merely endured or, if possible, eliminated. Of course, these are not perfectly distinct categories, and many people experience elements of both simultaneously. Moreover, a prolonged and misunderstood awakening process may eventually lead to secondary clinical depression, while clinical depression may sometimes catalyze a process of awakening. The reality of human experience rarely fits perfectly into our conceptual categories. What is clear, however, is that our current culture does not offer adequate space, language, or support for people who are going through deep spiritual transformations. We do not have the modern equivalent of initiation rites, prolonged retreats, contemplative communities that traditionally provided structure and meaning for these processes. Instead, we have a system that treats all states of existential suffering as pathologies to be eliminated as quickly as possible, allowing the individual to return to normal functioning, that is, to the social and economic role assigned to them. This is a profound impoverishment, not only for the individuals directly affected, who are deprived of the opportunity to transform their suffering into growth, but for our entire society, which loses the wisdom and perspective that these individuals could bring if they had the necessary support to complete their transformational journeys. For it is precisely this wisdom, this expanded perspective, this questioning of the fundamental premises of our civilization that we desperately need at this critical moment in our history. We face unprecedented challenges, from climate change to technological disruption, from extreme political polarization to the increasing concentration of wealth and power. These are not problems that can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created them, to paraphrase Einstein. They require new ways of seeing, thinking, being. They require, in short, exactly the kind of transformation that many are experiencing as a depression that our culture tries to suppress. So what can we do, both as individuals and as a society, to create space for this transformation, to honor the potential of spiritual awakening, even when it presents itself in the form of suffering? As individuals going through this process, the first step may simply be to recognize the possibility that what we are experiencing may not be just an illness to be cured, but a transformation to be navigated. This does not mean rejecting medical help when it is genuinely needed, or denying the real biological component of many forms of mental suffering. But it does mean remaining open to the possibility that beyond any biochemical imbalance that may be present, there may be a spiritual dimension to our suffering that deserves attention. This may lead us to seek resources, traditions, and communities that recognize and support this dimension, that offer not just treatment for symptoms, but guidance for the transformation process, that help us find meaning in our suffering, integrate it into a larger narrative of growth and awakening, that provide us with practices, rituals, language to map the unknown territory we are crossing. For those close to someone who appears to be going through this kind of process, the most valuable thing may be simply to be present, to witness without judgment, to offer support without trying to fix. To recognize that although the suffering is real and sometimes frightening to witness, there may be a purpose in it that is not immediately visible. That sometimes the deepest way to help is not to rush the person back into a normal state, but to support them as they navigate toward something new, something that does not yet have a name. And as a society, perhaps the most important thing is to begin creating cultural spaces, institutions, practices that recognize and honor the spiritual dimension of human experience, including its most challenging aspects. We need a more nuanced approach to existential suffering, one that does not automatically reduce it to pathology. We need mental health systems that integrate the best findings of modern psychiatry with the wisdom of contemplative traditions. We need communities that can welcome individuals in transformation processes and offer not just treatment, but mentorship. Ultimately, we need to recognize that what we call the depression epidemic may be, at least in part, a sign that our culture is reaching the limits of its current paradigm. That the growing malaise many feel is not just a problem of individual adaptation, but a collective call to reevaluate the fundamental premises of our civilization, to question what it really means to live a good, meaningful, authentically human life, to create ways of being in the world that honor not only our capacity to produce and consume, but our innate need for connection, meaning, and transcendence. This is a work we can only do together, and perhaps, paradoxically, it is precisely those who have been touched by the dark night of the soul, those who can no longer fit comfortably into existing structures, who are best positioned to help us imagine and create something new, not from abstract theories or grand plans, but from their own lived experience of deconstruction and reconstruction, of symbolic death and rebirth. If we are truly facing a civilizational crossroads, as many indicators suggest, then perhaps we need not less depression, but more honesty about the depth of the crisis we face. Not more adaptation to an unsustainable system, but more courage to imagine and build alternatives. Not more normality, but more willingness to inhabit the uncertain and fertile space of not knowing from which new possibilities may emerge. Of course, there are no guarantees in this process. Not all suffering automatically leads to transformation. Not all crisis results in growth. There are real risks in romanticizing suffering or in denying medical help to those who truly need it. The line between awakening and collapse, between creative dissolution and simple disintegration, is often thin. Navigating this territory requires discernment, support, resources that not everyone has equal access to, but the opposite risk of medicalizing and systematically suppressing the signs that something deeper is happening is also real, and I argue potentially more dangerous in the long run. For if we do not create space for the new to emerge through us, if we continue to treat all signs of discomfort with the status quo as individual pathologies, we may be missing our best chance at collective evolution at a time when it is desperately needed. Let me be clear. I am not suggesting that we should glorify suffering for its own sake, or that all forms of depression are secretly transformative. Unnecessary suffering is a tragedy, not a path to enlightenment. What I am suggesting is a more refined discernment, a willingness to ask in each case, what is this suffering trying to tell us? Is there something to be learned here that we could not learn otherwise? Is there a dimension of this process that transcends the conventional medical model? And perhaps the most important question, how can we honor both the reality of suffering and its transformative potential? How can we offer compassionate relief without suppressing the deeper process that may be unfolding? I do not have simple answers to these questions. No one does. We are in unexplored territory, individually and collectively. What I do know is that we need new ways of thinking about existential suffering, ways that do not automatically reduce it to pathology, but that also do not irresponsibly romanticize it, ways that recognize its complexity, its potential, its risks, ways that allow us to navigate this difficult territory with more wisdom, more compassion, more possibility. Because in the end, the question is not just whether we are depressed or awakening. The question is, how can we use these experiences, however painful, to grow, to become more fully human, to contribute in our own unique way to the evolution of consciousness that our species and our planet so desperately need at this critical moment? These are not abstract or academic questions. They are questions that many of us face in our daily lives as we struggle to find meaning and purpose in a world that often seems hostile to those deeper pursuits. And they are questions that our society as a whole needs to confront if we are to navigate the immense challenges of the 21st century with wisdom and grace, instead of simply managing the symptoms of a collapsing system. What is at stake is not only our individual well-being, but the future of our species and countless others with whom we share this fragile and precious planet. And perhaps, paradoxically, it is precisely those who have been touched by depression, those who can no longer happily participate in the great collective destruction we call normality, who are at the forefront of this necessary evolution. Not because their suffering makes them special or superior, but because this suffering can, if consciously navigated, open doors of perception and understanding that remain closed to those who have never questioned the fundamental premises of our culture. So if you are in the midst of this difficult journey, if you are struggling with questions that have no easy answers, with feelings that do not fit into conventional categories, know this: you are not alone. Your suffering is not necessarily a sign that something is wrong with you, but maybe a sign that you are beginning to see what is wrong with the world we inherited. And that vision, painful as it is, may be precisely what we most need at this moment, not to withdraw from the world in search of some isolated personal transcendence, but to engage more deeply, more authentically, bringing what we have learned through our own process of deconstruction and reconstruction to the collective work of imagining and creating a wiser, more compassionate, more alive world. A world where existential suffering is neither pathologized nor romanticized, but recognized as an integral part of the human experience, potentially rich in meaning and purpose. A world where each of us has the opportunity to transform our personal wounds into sources of wisdom and connection. A world where the line between individual healing and collective transformation is not so rigidly drawn. This world will not come easily or quickly. It will not come through isolated technological or political solutions, as important as they are. It will come through countless acts of courage, compassion, and creativity, large and small, through the willingness of countless individuals to inhabit the uncertain space of not knowing, to question what has been taken for granted, to imagine what does not yet exist, and perhaps, for many of us, this process begins precisely in the darkest moments when the structures that sustained our sense of identity and meaning begin to crumble, when we can no longer continue living as we were, when we are forced to face the hardest and deepest questions about what truly matters, about who we really are, about how we should live. Moments that our current culture is quick to label as depression, as dysfunction, as something to be overcome as quickly as possible so that we can return to normality. But which can, if approached with a different mindset, reveal themselves as portals to something much richer, deeper, and truer than the normality we left behind. It is not an easy path. There are no guarantees. But perhaps it is the only path that offers the possibility of authentic transformation, both personal and collective. The only one that allows us to glimpse and work toward a world where human flourishing is measured not by GDP or the accumulation of possessions, but by the depth of our connections, the authenticity of our expressions, the wisdom of our collective choices. A world that at the moment may seem impossibly distant, but that may be closer than we imagine if we have the courage to follow the thread of our own awakening wherever it leads us, to trust that on the other side of what appears to be depression, there may be a way of being that is more true, more connected, more alive than anything we knew before. Not because suffering itself is transformative, but because the willingness to face it honestly, to question what it reveals to us about ourselves and about the world we have created, may be the first step in a journey of discovery and creation that does not end with our individual healing, but extends outward to the healing and transformation of the world we share. If these reflections have touched something you have been feeling, but perhaps have not found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our age and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us in this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. Because perhaps in the end, the transformation we seek is not something we can achieve alone. Perhaps it is something we can only discover together through conversations like this, through the shared courage to ask the hardest questions and the collective willingness to live in the answers, no matter how uncertain and evolving they may be. The road ahead is not clear, but perhaps it does not need to be. Perhaps it is enough to take the next step together with open eyes and hearts willing to learn. This is the invitation. This is the journey. And it begins always exactly where we are now.
We cannot predict what will be the next stage of human evolution because it depends on the decisions that we make, all of us make, in the coming years. We now have powers almost like divine powers, like the powers of the gods. We can create completely new life forms, we can change ourselves, we can change our bodies, we can change our minds, but the same powers could also destroy us or destroy the whole world. I can't predict what we will do with our powers because it depends on us, on all of us, on the decisions we make. I hope that people will make responsible decisions.
Most information in the world is junk.
In just a word or two, explain why modern AI might destroy democracy.
The key issue is that democracy is based on trust, whereas dictatorship is based on terror.
This extremely cynical view of humans is not true.
What you've done in your recent book, Nexus.
The book is about the history of information.
To offer a different lens for information.
Information isn't truth.
It's not a question of helpful or dangerous. It's the magnitude of the change.
We need more boring politicians, for instance.
For sure.
Suffering is the rejection of reality.
One of the last stories that still connects everybody is the story of money.
This whole problem becomes much greater with AI.
AIs can make decisions. They are not just tools in our hands, they are agents creating new realities.
$7,000, $25,000 unarmed civilian. Keep it like that.
Should AIs have the ability to open a bank account and manage a bank account? That's a very practical question. We are very close to the point when you can tell an AI, go out there, make money, your goal is to make $1 billion. And one of the things about money, it's a very easy goal to define. An AI can make money in many ways. It can hire its services to people to write their essays or books or whatever, many things it can do. It can earn money. It can then invest this money in the stock exchange. So do we as a society want to allow AI agents to open bank accounts and manage them in any way they see fit? And then this is not a question for 50 years. This is a question for 5 years, maybe 1 year.